Siddhartha Dev was born in Shillong, India, and now lives in Harlem, New York. His fiction and non-fiction have been longlisted for several awards and been awarded the Pen Open Prize. His journalism and his essays have appeared in many prestigious journals and newspapers, including the New York Times and The Guardian. His latest novel, published last year, The Light at the End of the World, is considered a breakthrough in form. We also have Devika Rege from Pune. Welcome to Kolkata, both of you. Devika's award-winning debut novel, Quarter Life, was published in India in 2023. A political buildings romance set in contemporary India, it has been praised as a landmark novel. Her work also appears in several prestigious publications. Over to you, Payal, and to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Good afternoon and welcome to this session. Today we celebrate the birth anniversary of our much-loved freedom fighter, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And on stage we have two very accomplished authors who will be talking about a different kind of freedom, the freedom that fiction gives them. So we'll dive straight into the conversation. Both Devika and Siddharth's novels have this common thread, a sense of angst, there's palpable anger, and there's yearning for a new India. And fiction obviously gives them a greater degree of freedom. So I'll begin with Siddharth, who's been a journalist, done a couple of non-fiction books. In fact, this is his fourth book. So over to you, Siddharth.
Yes. So did you want me to talk about how the journalism influences the fiction and the other way around?
You could start with that, and then I'll come to the specific questions.
Okay. Well, I go back between journalism and fiction, between narrative nonfiction and fiction, because they allow me to do very different things. I like to do nonfiction or journalism because it takes me out of my head, it takes me away from books, it takes me into the real world. I began, in fact, my career as a journalist here at The Statesman, and in fact, some of my former colleagues are here. So, I have a great deal of respect for the virtues of old-fashioned reporting, of going out there, asking questions, listening to other people, hearing other voices. So that's the journalism, that's the nonfiction. And then fiction allows you to do something else entirely, even though they are connected. Fiction allows you the freedom to imagine. In fiction, I can do the things that I can't do in nonfiction, where I'm dependent on facts, I'm dependent on what other people say. I may not agree with them, but if they have said something, that's what I'm bound to write down. I can't make up things. I can't go inside someone's head. I can't, and my novel is not a straightforward realist novel. I can't imagine alternatives. I can't imagine alternate realities. These are not things you can do in nonfiction.
Yes, one of the disadvantages that journalists faces is that you can never allow your imagination to run right. But you have this fantastical setting, and to quote a line from the book, it's a world of fever dreams. And your friend Carl Bromley even asked you, which you say in the dedication, what you were smoking when you wrote this. So obviously this has given you the canvas to explore a completely different side of you as a writer.
Yeah, I mean, the short, simple answer is I wasn't smoking anything when I wrote this. It was the only drug imbibed on a regular basis was lots of coffee. So I wasn't actually smoking anything when I wrote this, but actually this has become a thing. Because in the New York Times, when Abraham Verghese reviewed the book, he spent quite a bit of time pondering over this, this blurb, so this epigraph. But yeah, Carl Bromley is an editor, a fiction editor in New York. He's not my editor, but he's a friend of mine. And Carl was the first person to read the novel in manuscript in its entirety. And I don't know, I mean, I hope, I'll keep it short because I want Devika to come into the conversation as well. But there is a kind of vulnerability that you have when you're writing fiction, a kind of tremendous vulnerability. It doesn't matter how many books you've written before because this is new. It's different from a journalistic piece, which is not as alone. There is an editor behind you. There is an editor who you can talk to for the whole, there's more back and forth. There are fact checkers in America. it's not a lonely process. It's actually a kind of collective effort, which I really like. But fiction, the way I work it, and this is a very big novel. It was a very big, ambitious novel. It's a departure from South Asian fiction in English writing, not just Indian, but South Asian fiction in English. And so, I felt particularly vulnerable. And Carl was the first person who read it in full. And he sent me a text, I think halfway through, and said, "What were you smoking when you wrote this?" And that was exactly the response.
And it's a thought that crosses many readers' minds too, I'm sure.
Yeah, I wanted to write a novel that was not very well behaved. And I thought, this is the reaction I want the reader to have, that, oh, this is wild, this is imaginative, this is unexpected, where you're going. So that's why Carl is one of the people the novel is dedicated to, because he was my first reader and he responded in exactly the way I wanted my imagined ideal reader to respond.
And for Devika Rege, Quarter Life is her debut novel. From a young girl who wrote poems, and then went on to make a corporate career in sales, then this book happened. Just share this journey with us, because it sounds quite incredible, and now an acclaimed author.
Thank you. So I didn't grow up in an environment where there were other writers. Everyone was a doctor or an engineer or a business person. And so though I wanted to study literature, my parents encouraged me to, you're good at language, so why don't you do advertising and marketing and get a job? And so that's how I landed up in the corporate world. And I have to say it was a fabulous education for a writer in many ways. I was very much a Bombay-Pune girl before that, but my job allowed me to travel to over 15 states in the country and sort of really expand my, just my ideas of what people's lived reality is. And, but I wasn't, my heart wasn't in it. And so at some point I quit and I applied for a master's degree in writing, and I was lucky enough to get a scholarship. My letter of recommendation was by my sales boss, and he said, "I don't know much about literature, but she's a good kid," I went abroad, I finished that, and I came back. And when I came back, this was 2013, the whole atmosphere, at least in my corner of the country, had really changed. The streets were full of protest, whether it was over Nirbhaya, whether it was the anti-corruption movement, whether it was recriminalization of homosexuality. And then this election comes in, which is, again, deeply polarizing in a way I have never seen before, with regard to the middle class especially. And so you had people who've never talked about politics beyond voting day or the 9 o'clock news, suddenly having all these opinions on the country, all these opinions on democracy. And that polarization, I think, really took hold at the level of family, at the level of friends groups. I think in the US it would have probably been similar in 2016,
Trump, yes.
or Brexit in the UK.
Sort of dividing families.
So there was a sense that this was a kind of reckoning, and it was close enough home to be familiar and yet new enough to be uncomfortable. And so that's how I felt that, that this was my subject. This is what I wanted to explore through my fiction for the first book.
And how challenging was the process? You have lots of subplots, many characters, intricately crafted. Was it difficult, or did it come easy?
It's interesting that Siddhartha said journalism and nonfiction took him outward to the world, because for me that was fiction. I wasn't too interested in my own life. I think my own experience was only a starting point for any of the subplots in the book. And so my research for the book spanned almost 6 years. It was almost anthropological. I've actually lived with the people and communities that are in the book, whether it's with right-wing youth groups in small towns in Maharashtra, whether it's talking to people, like revisiting my own experiences, like going back to the corporate world and seeing what that election had meant for people, how they were thinking. The corporate world was very apolitical when I worked in it. Everything changed by the end
In fact,
of 14.
most of the conversation that you share in the book between characters, you've probably lived through those moments.
Yeah, it's funny, I was recently on a campus to talk about the book, and one of the young students said to me, "Oh, I can't imagine a conversation like this because I would never make friends with such different views in the first place." And so I think that polarization now is probably really complete. But back in 14, I think many of us went through these conversations that were reckonings. I remember seeing a Facebook post by an ex-colleague. We always thought we were similar because we were these two artsy people in the office who listened to jazz and things. And then I remember reading his political views, and in my mind, I just thought, so this is who you are. You know, and that, I think many of us had that moment
Absolutely,
around that time.
yes.
And whether or not that is a person's politics are the sum of who he is, just the fact that I think a lot of people felt that way seemed material enough for the work.
In fact, in one of your characters even says, like, we shouldn't talk politics because it just ends up, spoiling the entire mood.
And that's what's happened now, right?
Yes.
We have all these family groups where no one's allowed
Absolutely.
to, like, dialogue is completely
Absolutely.
broken down. So.
Totally. And Siddharth, with your nonfiction, you've had some legal issues, the last nonfiction. So in this book, you've used phrases like heartless parliament, heartless city for Delhi, ruthless ambitions, manufactured lies. You keep referring to a thundering, glossy-head news anchor. I think we all know who we are trying to refer to, maybe, but you can tell us more. In fact, when this news anchor, when there are floods in Kerala and he's inviting viewers to participate in an opinion poll, would Muslims, Christians, Marxists in Kerala deserve rescue missions? Sadly, the results dismal. It's thumbs down for evacuation and thumbs up for drowning. Just share, does fiction give you a sense of empowerment? You can say what you want without much fear?
No, I mean, there's always fear. There's always vulnerability when you're writing. I mean, it's not going to be good writing if if you're not struggling to some degree.
But you may not be taken to court.
I mean, I'm sorry, I got an email yesterday from a friend of mine in Bangalore who just read a piece of mine who said, I'm surprised they let you into this country.
Oh,
and I
gosh.
say that every time I come in, I think this might be the last time that I am coming in. But I have never pulled my punches. Whether in fiction or non-fiction, I haven't pulled my punches. I've always had a quarrel with India, and my quarrel with India goes back it's much older than the Hindutva. It includes the neoliberalism. My nonfiction book is now people talk about it in great, very positively. But when it came out, there was a lot of critique that he's critiquing India shining. He's critiquing corporate models of development. Every piece of mine that comes out, I have friends and family, they say, why are you always like, doing these negative pieces? So, and it's not that, but I grew up in the Northeast, and which is really important for me. I grew up in the Northeast, I grew up in Shillong. I have seen the Indian state in a kind of from an angular way, and often as a very violent entity. And often the things that were happening, and my first two novels talk about that the things that are happening in the Northeast are just not of meaning in the mainland, as we call it. So I've always remained very close to that. I mean, I'm still very deeply connected to people in the Northeast about the civil war going on in Manipur. I see things that are going on. So, it's not that in fiction, yeah, people can still sue you in fiction. I mean, people can sue you for anything. Arundhati Roy was sued for God of Small Things. Graham Greene talks about his experience of, being when you have the kind of the British libel laws, which you do in India, you can be sued for anything. So, but yeah, that's not the reason. The thing is that fiction allows you the space to imagine things differently. I wanted this novel, my novel is not just about this moment. It is about this moment, but also how this moment is connected to other moments in the past. It is also about Bhopal and Union Carbide. It is also about what is forgotten or what is pushed to the side. It is also about the future. And so, I love that, I do have friends in India. Indian readers do play this guessing game and who's this character. And readers are totally free to do whatever they want with what you write.
News anchor they have in mind there.
But when this novel came out in America, people think this is what I'm describing in India is a fantasy. They don't think it's real until we had the wildfires and then the skies in New York turned yellow. And then I suddenly started getting messages from people saying, we're getting triggered by your descriptions of Delhi. And I said, well, suffer, since why should only people in the global south suffer? You suffer too, But, so there's always this strange, the fiction, the whole point is it allows you to imagine, it allows you to play with language. I don't want you to think about, you can think about whoever you want to think about, but I like to have that little space of ambiguity. Which is what fiction allows. You can play a lot with that space.
And Devika, coming back to the empowering feature of fiction. One of your characters says, the idiot millions all set to vote hate to power. Another one says, the crazy fringe has gone mainstream. You think it's much easier to do, I mean, when you have characters saying this, share your thoughts?
Sorry, what's the question?
So like, it gives you more freedom to express your views. Like suppose in a report, one couldn't really write crazy fringe has gone mainstream or idiot millions all set to vote hate to power. People have to be a little bit more tempered and a little more cautious when they're writing a report. But fiction gives you a greater freedom because your characters are having a discussion saying contradictory, I mean, each one is expressing their own thoughts.
So, I mean, I do think there are a lot of brave journalists who write, in the face of fear. I've never written nonfiction, but definitely the project of fiction was not just about having a veil to express things that I was not able to say in person. It's much, much more than that. It's much more than a reaction. I mean, why else would, in times of safety and peace, the arts flourish, And so I think it's much more to do with what Siddhartha is saying in terms of imaginative possibilities. And I'll just give you an example, like one of the small ways in which that works. Fiction writers, by default, work with something called composites. It means your characters are not nakedly autobiographical. You will usually take the face of somebody you know and the punchlines of someone you interviewed and something of your own experience of maybe being a woman like your character, even if you're not from the same minority. And that's how you create this entity. And I think, well, why do writers do this, right? Because what are you doing really? You're taking the raw material of the world, which is very immediate and very real, and you have that delta to change just that little thing over there. And in the case of Quarter Life, I'm asking questions. In the case of The Light at the End of the World, there's what you're suggesting is with a little bit of change, this is what dystopia can look like. In a book like After Messiah by Akar Patel, we cannot imagine any alternative to this present moment, but he shows us all it takes is a few moves for a very different kind of person to come to power. And I think that's why demagogues are as afraid of fiction as they are of nonfiction. That's why books get burned, because fiction shows readers that an alternative is encoded in the DNA of the present moment. And power thrives on the fact there's no alternative, or at least the perception that there's no alternative. So to me, fiction is potent. Most novels today that touch on politics are being sent through legal checks. Even at my publisher, Quarter Life was as well. This was something that was traditionally done only for nonfiction. So I do think you're more in the front line if you're writing in the vernacular and you are writing nonfiction, but at the same time, I don't think the draw towards writing in fiction is just because it's safe. It's very much more about the power encoded in the medium and the possibilities encoded in the medium.
And Siddharth, Bibi, in the first section of your book, she's a disillusioned journalist. Are there any elements of you in her? And also in the book, you talk about behind every published story, there are several unpublished ones. As a journalist, have you also faced this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Bibi is a disillusioned journalist. I mean, if you're asking if she takes after me, yeah, I'm a disillusioned everything, though. I'm a disillusioned journalist, a disillusioned academic, a disillusioned writer. I mean, I thrive on that disillusion. But, just to talk about, just to go back to the thing of, journalism, one reason that journalism cannot do in India what it cannot do. See, I started here as a journalist in '94 at the Statesman in Kolkata, as in the sports section of the newspaper. I have seen a shrinking of what reporters, what journalists are allowed to do. That is not happening because of some limitations in the form or because there are limits. I know wonderful young Indian journalists. I know amazing young Indian journalists. They meet me all the time. They're often coming from underprivileged backgrounds. They're often the first generation to have gone to college. They do amazing work. The problem is that they can't place their stories. That is not happening because of a problem with journalism. It's happening because of the management, because of the media, because the media has sold out, the media is enamored of power. But it's not just the media. I mean, I'm going to go out further. Of course, you said this, the court case is going on. The Supreme Court judge, I think I was told by Caravan, objected to my use of the word loitering in The Beautiful and the Damned. I mean, have you read like any American journalism? Gary Indiana's opening line, who's a wonderful, great American writer, his opening line on the presidential primaries in New Hampshire in 1992 is, Bill Clinton looks like a piece of fecal tissue, full stop, for the Village Voice. So you can't import American iPhones and American drones and then say, but oh, we're not going to have the freedom of speech. Oh, we're not going to have the journalism. We are going to have, you are going to pick and choose. That's what's created this atmosphere in journalism. But there are still very brave journalists here. I know a lot of them. I meet a lot of them. I go around the country in the vernacular, in Hindi.
But sometimes they pay a price for that too.
Yes, I mean, most famously Gauri Lankesh. I mean, but of course there are many examples. But it's not that fiction writers are immune. And ultimately, look, I think we're talking about two things. I mean, fiction takes a kind of, in our time, it takes a kind of courage to challenge the politics, the consensus. But you can also get an energy from that, from taking it on, because you don't believe in the sort of the hype that is going on. And then, of course, there's the other kind of courage which you would need even if we lived in a beautiful society, which is just the courage that you need to create something, because, it's a leap of faith. So, yeah.
And Devika, in your book too, one of the characters, Kedar, faces this with his mining story. Tell us a bit about that.
So Kedar is a character in the book who is, he's modeled on a lot of RTI journalists and what they're trying to do in the environmental space in Maharashtra. Without taking names, there was a case of a journalist who was killed for this in 2015 at the time I was writing the book. Hello?
The system has kicked in. No.
Sorry? No, it is. It's all right. And so, yes, to write that character, I did speak to a lot of people in the same position. I was fortunate enough to have friends who put me in touch with Nikhil Day and Aruna Roy, and I was very inspired by the kind of work that they're doing. And that character came out of that, out of seeing that research through, I think. Yeah.
Siddhartha, coming to your book, you have these 4 distinct sections set in different time periods, each a landmark. What prompted you to select these specific periods? And what is the biggest challenge you faced while doing this?
Well, yeah, the frame of the novel, the main story is about BB in a slightly alternate, slightly near future Delhi, and it's very subtle. So that's the main story. And within there are 3 novellas tucked in, one that is set in 1984, just before the Bhopal disaster in Bhopal, the Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal. The 3rd novella is set in Calcutta, actually, in 1947, just before the partition. And then the 4th section is set just after the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857, and it's basically a contingent of English soldiers riding towards North Bengal, towards the Himalayas, to track down the last remaining fugitive from the Sepoy Rebellion. Why did I choose these? I suppose I was interested in these moments of history. I'm always interested in history. I'm interested in the past. All these moments had been written about very well. There are amazing existing, narratives, fiction and nonfiction about them. But I think there's a certain kind of obsession I had. I saw them as a kind of end-of-the-world moments. I think the Sepoy Rebellion, for instance, has disappeared from memory, but it was really far more ghastly than we kind of know. We're not taught this stuff in school. It didn't happen even in the, pre-Hindutva years, and it doesn't happen now. It was really, really quite ghastly, the degree of slaughter, the degree of violence. And 1984, Bhopal, I have reported in Bhopal on the 30th anniversary. I am struck by the fact that it's the worst industrial disaster in the history of the world. And it is completely forgotten in the United States, and it's completely forgotten here. I have spent a lot of time with the survivors, with people, activists, and I've written about it in nonfiction, and it was still a wound that wouldn't go away. So, it came back. And then the same thing is true of partition and the violence of partition. My father was a young man in Kolkata in 1946-47 and was big, we were refugee. He was a refugee he was from Sylhet, from East Pakistan. So I just felt that these were moments of end of the world moments, and they were connected, but they were also very exciting. This is a terrible thing to say. They are terrible moments in history, but they're also very exciting for a writer to try and tackle and do them not as historical narratives, not as realist narratives, but slightly speculative narratives. So in each case, you begin very much in the historical, but then it veers away towards a kind of more counterfactual, alternative reality, speculative fiction. I'm playing with history. Like, the 1857 section, there's a quote from Lord Elgin, who said this thing about, you can't respond to Indians. He's talking about his servants. And he said, you can't treat them as even as dogs because you have to treat them as machines. And so I thought, what if some of the natives were really machines? Could you write a story about that? And I did. So that's what, you have to read to find out. But what if some of the natives were actually machines, turned out to be machines? So there is a kind of, there has to be a joy to also playing with fiction. Otherwise, it's hard to sustain yourself. It's like 7 years of work and you're sitting by yourself. And so yeah, I chose these moments of the end of the world. But it's really playing with genre, playing with storytelling is where the imagination, playing with imagination, that's where the hope, the light, that's the light in the title of the novel. One of the lights in the title of the novel is the end of the world. But there are also these things we can do. We can tell stories and we can be very playful about them. And I really enjoyed that.
And Devika, for you also, it was a long, long journey, 7 years?
Yeah, 7 years. That's telling. Is there a question, or should I talk?
Yeah, just tell us more.
Yeah, so I've already spoken a bit about my research. I think one of the things that it also took a long time to arrive at was the structure of the work. It's not just a sort of simple realist story from beginning to end. Even though it's not dystopian or sci-fi or any of that, it's very much rooted in reality. When I started, I thought this is a story about India, and I wanted these three perspectives, that of the insider, who comes in the form of this young man called Rohit, who's never left the country and is a filmmaker. There's the outsider, who's this American girl called Amanda, who comes here for social work. And there's this sort of insider-outsider, who's this NRI. Not NRI, he's lived in the US for many years, and he's coming back home. And so I started there, and it was a very instinctive choice. And many of you all will have read novels in the current day that have these three rotating perspectives, chapters named after each character. And I suppose it goes
that's
back.
very, very unusual. For me, it was, I hadn't seen that very often.
I mean, it goes all the way back to Faulkner, I think, or even older, but the modernists foreground it as a structural device. And I do think that modernism now is in the fabric of world literature, so you find a lot of Indian writing also which uses that form. But what happened as I continued to write and continued to interview people is, it's a book about democracy. So how can it be told from the perspective of two Savarna male men and one white woman? Sure. And so then there was this question of, can I broaden the number of perspectives in the work? Would it make it a more democratic work? And so and that's why the novel fans out. It goes from 3 characters to 9 to almost 40. Yes. And by which time the questions change. Then what happens to moral relativism if you're going to give everybody empathy, which is the question you asked earlier.
Absolutely.
In the session. So that's how each section of the book evolved in response to where the previous section had left us. And the book, I think, as a whole, speaks to a certain kind of, the evolution of a certain political, like I tried to encode it in the work and to show what that journey looked like rather than to keep going back to the beginning. Because even if I had gone back to the beginning and started with 9 characters, it would have essentially run into the same issue, which is that a novel can't represent a nation. Whom does it choose to represent? Where are the silences? And so I would rather have written a book that leaves the reader with those questions at the end for all novels written about this moment than to try and cover my tracks in some sense. So that's something that evolved over time and wasn't there at the beginning.
We'll come back to that in a minute. But before that, I want to ask Siddhartha, you've touched every incident that has sparked an outrage in India, whether it was the Bhopal gas tragedy, Nelly massacre, Bhagalpur blindings, 1984 riots, detention centers, farmers' protests, Hindu-Muslim clashes, demonetization, clamping down on the media. As someone who's lived in New York for 25 years, what are the challenges you face when you cover this?
There's this American music group called Steely Dan, and I think Calcutta people listen to. I think Steely Dan is quite big in Calcutta, but Steely Dan has this, interview where they talk about moving from New York to California, and they said in California we really missed New York. And so, we wrote songs about New York and we were in California, and then we missed New York so much that we went back to New York. We moved back to New York. And then we immediately started writing songs about California. And so for me, I have always lived, I had to leave this country in order to become a writer. I'm sorry, I don't come from privilege or wealth. I needed jobs. And so, New York allowed me that kind of space to imagine. And, writing about India from New York is not of an order of difference from sitting in Delhi and writing about Shillong, because, there's always a sense of loss. There's always a fear that you are missing things. But, I am also very, very connected to India because of my journalism. That's part of it. So I often have assignments. I was in Ayodhya 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago. I was there. I spent a lot of time. That is going to be in a nonfiction.
And the next nonfiction is also?
The next nonfiction book it'll be out in April. That will contain that. But I have spent a lot of time in Bhopal, and not just for reporting. Bhopal sort of became an obsession. I went back again and again. It was partly to research, but it was also partly relationships, right? One of my, Abdul Jabbar in Bhopal became one of my friends. He was a great activist who died a couple of years ago, sadly. There are some amazing journalists in Bhopal, actually, whom I know, whom I hang out with when I go there. They can't write the stuff that they want to write, but that's because of the owners, that's because of the management. So, there are deep relationships. And, beneath the surface, there are also stories there, for instance, which are not mainstream, like Manipur, for instance. Like, there's one particular story which I have twisted a little bit in fiction. But, when I read it, people gasp with horror. But it's actually based on actual documented facts. And obviously, I have a particular chip on my shoulder about the Northeast, that it never gets represented properly. It never gets represented accurately. So there's a lot of hidden stories.
I know it's very evident how much Shillong matters to you too, because you left Shillong 36 years back maybe, and it comes up several times in the book. So your birthplace, even if you're not living there, it's certainly part of you.
It's a form of intimacy, it's a form of connection. But again, things are very, so the thing is, it's not a straightforward relationship. So the Assam and the detention centers, this is quite weird. So in the novel, Bibi stops doing journalism because of something that went wrong when she did a story on a detention center in Assam. I wrote that imaginatively. I didn't go to Assam. I finished writing the novel. I finished the manuscript. And then I got an assignment from the New York Times to go to Assam and write about the actual detention centers. And I was texting my friend, who's actually a Bengali, who worked at the Statesman for a while. I was texting him. I said, this is really creepy. I am going down this highway, which I have already described my character going down. She was not following in my footsteps. I was following in the footsteps of this character that I've created. But that's the gorgeous thing about fiction. Fiction is really surprising. Good. I think if it's good, it's really surprising even to the writer. So, it's always a back and forth. So I did the Assam detention center story well after. And then, I would think, and I remember this whole thing. I put in a bridge in the novel, which didn't exist at the time when I was researching it from New York, when I was writing it. But I said, oh, she needs to cross over. So I just put the bridge there. And then I went to Assam 3 years later, and they said, oh, they're building a bridge over there, which is really the same place where I had imagined it, which is very eerie, but also, it's kind of terrible. But yeah, being here in India, it's a kind of, you see the relationships between your fiction. But yeah, so that's how being in New York doesn't really matter if you allow yourself to feel, I think, to be open to what is out there.
And Devika, now moving to how do you see the nation in the next decade? One of your characters talks about why should one religion define our national culture? And another one says it's easier to sell hate than love. So where do you see our country in the next decade?
That's such a big question. That's really and almost overwhelmingly. I could write a whole novel just to feel my way into that question. I mean, there's of course so much that causes consternation. And I think to myself, if I had to write that novel, if I had to write a quarter life set in 2024, kind of what would be the questions that I'm exploring? And I think one of the things that well, you know, in 2014, there was a lot of smoke and mirrors. I think if you were someone who's been a journalist, you've kind of known the inside story. But if you're someone who's come from the blinkered middle class, you really didn't. We didn't even recognize, we didn't know what the RSS was about. It was that shadowy thing that occasionally filtered into the news, but you know, it seemed like something out of the history books. And so I think part of the endeavor of the novel was really, I mean, Siddhartha talks about sort of, you know, writing from New York and writing from India. For me, I'd lived in India almost all my life. You know, how does the fish know it's wet? And so you almost had to, the book was a way to understand the society around me better. And I think if I wrote that book in 2024, the question would not be so much about smoke and mirrors and where people stand, but just what accounts for the thrall. You know, we know the facts now. There's no doubt what the party stands for, and yet people are in thrall. And I don't know where that thrall will lead us, but I think that's what I'd investigate if I had to start and write again. Yeah.
And Siddharth, you talk about a world without suffering and profit, a universal basic income for every human being born anywhere. Is this utopia possible in the next few decades ahead?
Well, I think it's one of my characters who says it, and that's very important. And, you know, because characters have their, and I think one of the other characters kind of, you know, calls her a crazy Marxist bitch when she says this, right? But, so, you know, debate is like really, in a novel, can be quite a delightful thing. No, I don't really, I hesitate to, I have never done this prognosis of the future for the nation. I think it's a middle class need. It's not a, and I don't mean just India. I see this in the US too. It's like, oh, tell us, you know, how things will get better. Well, they're not going to get better like in a day or 2 months because these processes are so deep.
Yes, in one of your interviews, you've said, I'm not in the business of giving false hope, false optimism.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I think,
no predictions for the summer of 24?
Oh, no, I don't want to do that. I think I don't want to do that. I know deep down in my heart, I think what is going to happen, and I think I said somewhere, I would be really happy to live in a world, not just a nation, but a world where my fiction is just a fictional thing and actually doesn't have anything to do with reality. It's just an aesthetic thing. But sadly, you know, yeah, I think things are very terrible, and not just in India. Again, this is where being in New York, things are pretty terrible in the United States too. Things are pretty terrible in Gaza too. You know, and these things do affect one. So, I mean, the simple thing is, yeah, I mean, I believe in that we are interconnected, and we are interconnected across religion, which is a very important thing to recognize here, but also across race, across gender, across species, and across nations. I mean, this is a very simplistic truth, but it's the only truth that is there. We are actually part of something that is not just us.
Thank you so much. We can take questions from the audience now. The mic. Who's got the mics?
Does somebody...
a mic for the gentleman.
For a mic for the audience?
Oh, let them...
You can just take one of these.
What's the time? I thought it was way beyond.
Working great. Hi, I have a question for Siddharth, but I'll borrow a line from what Devika just said. I mean, your book makes you feel that there is a lot of familiarity, but there's certain parts of it that's still alien, which was her line, and why, you know, an author will always have the best way to words. When you wrote that book, I also kind of sensed that there's a deep hurt or anger with the way things are, and the deep desire that things should be different. Is that how it is? Am I getting it right? Or, you know, you just wrote it as a piece of fantastical fiction and just left it out there?
Oh, thank you, Diman. No, that is absolutely... The fantastical is a way of finding hope in response to the anger at how things are. And I suspect I don't know. People say, you've always been angry. I think I met a former editor boss of mine in Delhi, and he said, you were like this when you were 25 years old as well. And I said, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I do ask these questions. Why should some people suffer needlessly? And yeah, so there is a kind of deep anger and anguish, but the fantastic, the speculative, there are ways to make the anger something more creative, make it more about possibility. And in that sense, that's what fiction and writing, it doesn't have to be speculative. Even finding a plot, even finding a story. It's this, you might be writing about terrible things, but there is a beauty in the shape of a line, in the shape of a plot. I always get slightly thinking, people always talk about journalism, but I'm very interested in language. I'm very interested in poetry. And when I'm writing fiction, the question of language, the question of doing different voices for the different sections was very, very empowering to me. And it's a way of not sinking into despair and anger. It's a way of getting out of bed in the morning because you are trying to find this voice for this character, and you are trying to see how this character might see their world and how you might describe it. There's an incredible privilege to it, to be able to do this, right? But yeah, so it is a way to respond to the anger. And anger is a great starting place, but it's not sufficient by itself.
Next question.
I had a question for Siddhartha, actually, in response to what he said. Sorry, am I? Well, one of the things that troubles me a lot when I'm writing, and I think some of the writing is a response to that, is this tension between the aesthetic and the ethical. What does it mean to represent things that are deeply traumatic in language that is transcendent, people who are deeply broken and extremely ableist? Just the word mastery implies someone's at the receiving end. So I don't know, does that taint the pleasure? Does it, how have you grappled with that as a writer?
It's a great question, and I think we need to struggle with it anew. But beauty doesn't belong to anybody. You do not. At the moment, I feel very vulnerable because I have met somebody who's very somebody. I'm very glad you talked about the idea of mastery and the privilege of being ableist, basically, right? But beauty doesn't belong to anybody. You don't have to be able to see in order to have a sense of beauty. You don't have to be able to hear in order to have a sense of beauty, right? I mean, my friend, who's a great poet, yesterday he was showing me this Bangladeshi photographer who began to lose his sight and has switched to music, and he was playing me some of the music. So this person is dealing with this incredibly difficult sort of loss by finding another way to create beauty. And I think we do need to create beauty. I mean, I am very political, and I always see myself as very, very much engaged in the question of engaged with, the reality, with social reality, with inequality. But I'm also very deeply interested in beauty, because beauty is a way for us to find ways to sustain ourselves, to fight. So a beautiful line, a beautiful sentence, a beautiful image, a beautiful piece of music, it gives you something, right? Not just me, the person, the creator, but it gives others. And we need that in order to sustain ourselves, because what we see around us, all the things we're talking about, that's one of the things they're closed off too, right? That there is no joy, there is no pleasure, there is no beauty, there is no sense of fulfillment. It's just this endless hatred and craving, and we are working against that with whatever we have at our disposal.
A very good afternoon to all present. My question is to Siddhartha sir. Sir, you do realize that dystopian fiction has a established tradition, and we are talking about Orwell and Huxley. So when you were writing, do these authors come into play an inspiration role for you? And also one more question, that you would often realize that what is dystopian for others could be utopian for some, and what is utopian for some could be dystopian for others. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I'm not. Yeah, Orwell and Huxley. I think I've written about this in sort of culture. I do cultural essays. Yeah, I mean, for me, they're slightly dated, and they're kind of this very Anglo-colonial, Anglo-American syllabus. I mean, they are interesting writers. They're good writers. But I'm much more influenced by Afrofuturism than by Orwell and Huxley, and like by contemporary writers like Victor Laval, or in the U.S., contemporary, African, Afro-American writers. I'm very influenced by that because there is a political project there. Yeah, and the second question, no, I don't agree that what is utopian for some is dystopian, what is dystopian is utopian for others. I write about in my nonfiction, that this idea in Ayodhya to create a Hindu utopia, but it's really not a Hindu utopia. I mean, deep down, if you do reporting, even if you imagine the India where there's nobody other than a certain kind of believing Hindu, there is no imagination. This is not a realm of justice. It's still very hierarchical. I mean, I have sat with RSS people. It is very hierarchical. There is women in their place and men in their place, and they'll argue that no, caste system came in with the Muslims and the British, but then they'll describe their utopia. And it's like, it's a reinvention of dystopia. So no, I don't agree. Of course, we can have critiques of utopian visions as well, whether they are even if they are left utopian visions, we can talk about the dystopic that might be in them. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, I'm really interested in these very liberatory, radical sort of traditions of imagining utopia and dystopia, and Afrofuturism is one of the great influences on my writing.
I think there's a question there.
Hello. I have a question for Devika, ma'am. In a lot of ways, quarter life is about a group of people sort of finding their politics, right? And I'm sure as an author, you have your own politics as well. So while consciously crafting such psychologically alive characters, did you have to sort of keep your politics out of the way, or do you think you could lend it to your characters in a way as well? So, yeah.
It's a great question. Of course, if you've lived in this country and witnessed everything that's happened in the past 10 years, there is it's inescapable that a writer will have a personal politics. And but for me, the place of the novel is really, it's really a medium that allows you to hold more than you. Let me just put it this way: the novel is, it's more complex a creature than I am as a person or a citizen. And often when I was writing, my task was to just feel like I'm holding all these other voices and trying to funnel them towards something. And yes, there were many times while taking interviews where I would sort of feel the muscles of my face harden because something that someone was saying was somewhat triggering, either because it showed the narrowness of their political views, or then, because it was exposing the narrowness of my political views. And so that was there. But I think fiction is a kind of discipline where you are constantly, where you have to constantly remind yourself to sort of settle down and listen and observe, because that is something that the political manifesto cannot do. That is very much, the domain of literature or nonfiction when it becomes literature. I will say that, it's not easy. It's not without consequence. It might be fine to sit down and mindfully observe something for 10 years, but one of the questions that the book itself raises is, at whose time on whose time do you do that, and at whose cost do you do that? And so this tension between empathy and judgment, where if you judge too quickly, you might risk one kind of, problem, but on the other hand, if you empathize too far, you cloud your judgment. That's something that was with me throughout the writing process. And some of these dilemmas, I don't know that they have absolute answers, but they are certainly present both in the, both in the arc of the characters and in the form of the work. And there are moments where I did take a call because I thought it was the ethical call, even if it did not seem like the thing that that might aesthetically please the reader. And through those moments, there's actually a lovely essay that I've referenced in my writing as well, called The Author as Producer. It's by Walter Benjamin. And that gave me a lot of answers, because one of the things he says in that is that there is no difference between the moral and the literary tendency of a work. A work that is more tuned into ethics will be a more aesthetic work. And I found that very liberating. And so, yes, the novel does have many voices in it. yes, it did take a lot of sitting down and shutting up and listening to be able to capture those voices. But yes, there is also an ethical undercurrent that I hope saves it from complete moral relativism and somebody's utopia becoming someone's dystopia and the other way around, in which case everybody cancels each other. And how do we conceive a different kind of world? So,
in fact, your book is a collage with characters with hugely contradictory views.
yes.
And I guess that's the only way forward because you can't sort of silence any one group. I think we are running out of time now. So I just wanted to add that Siddharth's last book, I read the last page thrice because it vacillates between hope and despair. I just hope that the coming decades have more hope. As they say, Umeed pe duniya kayam hai. We can't afford to lose hope. Thank you so much for being such a good audience.
Thank you so much, Devika, Siddharth, and Payal, for moderating their perspectives so beautifully. From contemporary novels and politics, we now move to the realm of poetry. We have with us three poets, Renu Roy, Lokhishree Banerjee, and Ajanta Paul. I'd like to invite them onto stage, along with the moderator for this session, Ashok Vishwanathan. As Thomas Hardy had said, poetry is emotion put into measure. The emotion must come by nature, but the measure can be acquired by art. I don't want to give very elaborate introductions and eat into the session time because not only will the poets be reading from some of their work, but they will also be in conversation about their motivation and inspirations. Renu Roy is a well-known personality in the field of the performing and currently also working on a book of short stories. Lokhishree Banerjee has many